Thank you all for being here. I'm Jolien. I'm a researcher at the Social Psychology Department. I recently finished my PhD there. And today I'd like to talk to you about one line of research that we developed during my PhD project together with my supervisors. And this is on psychological resilience. So we're interested in how members of disadvantaged social groups deal with those experiences, essentially, and factors that encourage or dampen resilience amongst them. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to dive straight in. So in, let's say, daily life, in the modern world, one of the most important psychological resources is resilience in dealing with struggles or difficulties that a person may face. I'm just going to stay on this side. So what we are interested in is not so much struggles or difficulties at the individual level, but rather at a group level. And specifically, we're looking at the fact that almost all societies are characterized by a degree of social inequality, prejudice, discrimination between social groups. In our own society, we can think of almost all ethnic minorities, but also women or the LGBTQI community that face prejudice and stereotyping and all these kind of related processes. And so we are interested in how people who are members of these devalued groups deal with these experiences. And so I would first like to say a little bit about what social devaluation looks like in, let's say, contemporary Western societies where our research takes place. So when we consider that, it's worth noting that prejudice and stereotyping and all these kind of processes, social devaluation, doesn't need to occur explicitly to have effects on members of disadvantaged groups. In fact, there is considerable evidence that these processes can take very subtle forms, right, and occur even at, let's say, the subconscious level. It's always difficult to give examples of what a subconscious example would be, but for instance, we could consider the experience of a woman. The studies I'll present later are also conducted in the context of gender identity. So we can consider, for instance, the experience of a woman who is overlooked for a promotion at work, and then later that same day, she is complimented by her neighbor for the way in which, I don't know, she raises her children or so on. So neither of these experiences is necessarily problematic in itself, but as these experiences build up over time or they are structural in someone's life, they can convey at let's say a much more subtle level information about the social roles for which such a person is suitable, and in that way reinforce ultimately, let's say, gender stereotypical roles. So when we consider how these subtle forms of social devaluation affect members of disadvantaged groups, we might say, oh, because it's more subtle, it's less harmful, maybe because it's just a little bit more mild or so. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the harmful effects of social devaluation occur even when the processes are very subtle. So, for example, when gender stereotypes are subtle, they elicit stereotype conformity. So women who are exposed to very subtle gender stereotypes, for example, show more submissive bodily postures, but also reduce performance in domains that are typically considered masculine domains, like spatial reasoning and let's say, mathematics and so on. So on the one hand, in spite of their subtle nature, these processes have very harmful effects on people who are exposed to them. And a second aspect of this subtlety is that it has been suggested that it undermines resilience, right? Because if the occurrence of social devaluation is very subtle, how can the victim really go about confronting that or addressing that, right? So we have on the one hand the fact that the harmful effects remain, but resilience is undermined as social devaluation becomes more subtle. It's worth noting also that in this kind of perspective, the victims of social devaluation are considered a little bit passive, right? So as the devaluation and prejudice becomes more subtle, they are less and less able to do something about it. So in our research, we pursue a little bit more of an active approach, and we argue that even when social devaluation is very subtle or even occurs outside of conscious awareness, still members of disadvantaged groups have strategies at their disposal that will allow them to confront or resist these the harmful effects of these things. So specifically, we focus on the role of social identity. Just in the for those of you who may not be aware of what that all means, social identity is essentially that component of a person's identity that is derived from their membership in social groups, right? So that can vary over people, what group memberships they are committed to, but it can also vary over time, right? So just around the time of the World Cup, you're suddenly very committed to your national identity, and then when the team loses, it returns to baseline of not being so important. So importantly for this project is that there is some evidence that social identity can provide people, so high commitment to a social group, can provide people with some coping resources. So people who are strongly committed to certain social groups, for example, perceive more social support from that group, but also the positive aspects of group membership are more salient to them. And so what we're interested in here is whether those beneficial effects of social identity commitment on resilience can also extend to situations in which devaluation is very subtle. So I would like to show you so we put these ideas to the test in a study in several studies actually on gender identity, where we exposed women to we subconsciously exposed them to a series of gender stereotypes, and we were interested in how they responded to those, specifically focusing on the influence of social identity on their responses there. And specifically in this case, in the case of gender identity, we're looking at feminist commitment to feminists as a group. And so we were interested in whether identification with the group of feminists could affect the resilience people show in dealing with subconscious gender stereotyping. So what we found was, firstly, in line with previous research amongst women who were non-feminists, so who did not identify with feminism, we showed that they, let's say, went along with the stereotypes to which they were exposed. So they started to think more stereotypically about their group. They associated their group with more stereotypical attributes. But importantly, we also found amongst a subgroup of high feminist identifiers evidence for resistance against gender stereotypes, right? So after exposure to subconscious exposure to gender stereotypes, they showed increased accessibility of the positive aspects of group membership. So they associated their group with more positive attributes, but also they showed counter-stereotypical behavior, right? So exposure to subtle gender stereotypes inspired them to behave counter-stereotypically. So rather than going along with the information they had been exposed to, they showed the opposite effects. They counteracted those things. So these findings are the first evidence that resilience can also occur in response to very subtle examples or very subtle occurrences of social devaluation. And in the future, given that these kind of resilience or resistance effects were only evident among some members of the group, but not others, we would like to extend this line of research also in a more interdisciplinary perspective to examine what are the factors that allow resilience to develop among some members of the group and not others, to ultimately be able to encourage this kind of resilience amongst members of the group who wouldn't normally show it. Together, these findings are the first evidence not only that resilience can occur in response to very subtle instances of social devaluation, but also of the beneficial effect of social identity in this context. So, yeah, that was a very quick little summary of some of the work we've done, and I think I'm also almost out of time, so that's all from me. Thank you.